Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be covering the basics of making your own custom UI components. The component we're going to focus on making will be a switch to replace the full screen toggle in the settings menu. Just as a note for everyone, since the last video I have upgraded the Unity version to 6.0, but everything that I show in this video should be valid from Unity 2022. So to get started, the first thing I'm going to do is create a new folder called Controls. In here I can keep all of the scripts for any custom components that we make now and in the future. I'm going to go in there, create a new monobehavior script because there isn't a separate visual element script, and we're just going to call this switch. I'm also going to go into the styles folder and I'm going to create a new UI Toolkit style sheet, which I'm going to call tutorial switch. We're going to be using both of these files at the moment. And lastly, I'm going to go into the panels, create myself a new UI document, which I'm just going to call demo. Let's open up our switch script. As you can see, this is currently set up as a monobehavior. First thing I'm going to do is remove all of the monobehavior code. And instead we're going to inherit from visual element. As you can see, this has an error. We just need to make sure that we're using the correct using Unity Engine UI elements. Next thing you want to do is make this a partial class and give it the attribute of UXML element. The class needs to be set as partial as Unity does generate some code in the background which replaces all the boilerplate that you needed to do in the original implementation of the UI Toolkit. But with these two parts, you are now able to view this file in the UI builder, which I'll show you later. The UXML element and partial is only required if you want to see it in the UI builder. If you don't, then and just want to apply these components in code, this isn't necessary. However, I'd recommend doing this regardless, as you never know how you might want to use your component in the future. The next step is to create the public properties and functions of the component. This will help define the edge of the code and keep all state information contained. We're going to create a public string and we'll just call this text. This will hold the text for putting the title next to the switch. We'll just give it a get and a set for a moment. We'll be upgrading this later on in the video. Next, we'll make a public bool called value. This will return the value of the switch itself. We'll also create a public action bool. This will allow you to subscribe to any events from outside of the script. This will be useful for architecting everything, and we'll call this toggled. And then the last thing that we're going to make is a constructor. So just public switch. These, unlike monobehaviors, work very much like standard C# script. So unlike a monobehavior where you have awake, start and update, in a visual element you don't. You just create constructors and destructors as you see fit. Next, to each of these components, or to the text and the value, we can now add UXML attribute. Same with the UXML element above. This makes these attributes show up in the UI builder, in the inspector window, so that you can toggle and change them in that context. Again, if you're not planning to use the UI builder or not planning to use UXML files, then these aren't necessary. But again, I recommend adding them anyway, just for completeness. If we now jump over into the UI builder, you can see I've got the demo UXML file opened. I'm just going to select that and click on canvas background. I've got it set to this nice grey colour. It's just going to make it easier to see the components that we're working on. And now if we go down into Library and select Project, you can see our switch custom control is waiting for us. We can now drag that into the hierarchy. You can see it's appearing in the scene, even though there's not actually anything in it yet. But we can have that selected, and you can see our text and value components are there ready. They don't do anything yet, but we can at least see them and see that we've set everything up correctly. I'm just going to save that and jump back into the code. So the next step in this process is to create the child elements in the hierarchy of this component. So for that, we're going to need a label, which I'm just going to call label. And then I'm going to want two visual elements in their own right, which I'm going to call border and control. So these are the new components that I'm going to be adding as child objects. To create these components, we'll go into the constructor and we'll just work our way down. So starting with label, we can do a new label. I'm just going to give it a default value. Everything works as it would creating standard C# classes. We haven't got to do any instantiation or anything. All we need is new label, and that is going to actually create those elements for us. We'll then do label.name. Again, this part is not necessary. This is going to name the visual element in the hierarchy. While not necessary, again, I would recommend doing it, especially when you start getting very complex components with lots of visual elements that are there just to help you with styling and layout. It can be really helpful to have the names available so that you don't get lost within your own hierarchy. So for this, I'm just going to call it text. Next, we'll create our border, which is going to be a new visual element. Nothing to go into the constructor this time. Just make sure this has the new keyword on it. Again, I'm going to give it a name. Border. And then the one extra part that I will do for the border is I'm going to use the add to class list. Now this will add a new class on top of this visual element that we can use in our USS file later on to style out the border that we need. I'm just going to call this switch-border. And then we're going to do the same for the control. So control equals new visual element. Control.name equals control. And control.add to class list switch control. Now, there's one last step that we need to do before this will actually appear in the hierarchy. We need to call add. So every visual element has a function called add, and this will add another visual element into this one's hierarchy at the next level. So the first thing we'll do is add the label. Next, we'll add the border. And now, because I want the control to sit as a child object of the border, I'm going to do border.add control. So in this instance, the label is going to be added to the switch as a child. The border is going to be added to switch as a child underneath the label. And then control is going to be added to border as a child of that object. And once again, if we just switch to the UI builder, we can see that now we've got our switch. There's actually some space there. And if I zoom in, you will see very dimly some text appeared. That's the default value that we set for the label. And if I open up the hierarchy, we can see it's got the text there, the border, and the control. You'll notice that these are grayed out. This is just telling you that you can't edit them and they are defined as part of this component. Now we have all of the visual elements, we can apply styles to make it look like an actual switch. In the initial version of UI Toolkit, I would have tried to do a lot of these changes in my IDE to make use of my defined USS variables. However, the current iteration of UI Builder has a lot more features, and now everything can be done in this window. So first thing we're going to do is add the style sheet that we created earlier. So we'll click this little plus, go to add existing USS. You should get a folder prompt opening up there. Just go and find your style sheet. As you can see, we've got our USS file with this visual element section added. We're just going to delete that, and we're going to add the first 4 selectors that we're going to need. Clicking in the text input will show you some examples of the selectors you can use. First one is, every time you click in there, it puts a dot in there for you to create a class. I'm going to delete that. I'm going to create switch. That's now going to select our C# element type. I'm going to delete that again and add another one, which is going to be switch space label. This will directly access the label that is sitting underneath the switch. And then next, I am going to create 2 classes. The first one being switch border, that we added earlier, and switch control. These are all the styles that we need for now to start seeing our switch the way that we want it. To start with, I'm going to make changes to the label to match all the other labels that we have across the project. So we're going to go down in the inspector section and we're going to find the text part. We're going to set the font style to bold. We're going to set the size to 26. And the color, we're going to click the 3 dots on the side here, and we have this set variable option. If we do that, it shows you all the different variables that are available to you. At the moment, we see all of the ones that are part of the Unity default runtime. If we scroll right to the bottom, you can see these are the ones that we created in the last video in our own root style. So from here, I'm going to select grade 2, and then that's going to color it in that sort of white with a slight bit of purple in it. That means if I go and change that variable, then this will be updated. In future videos, I would have set up more custom style variables, which will hold things like the size, and you could set that as a variable as well. It doesn't just have to be color, it can be any value you want. So that's our label handled. One quick note, if we just jump into the theme where the colors are stored, I have made a change since the last episode. These used to have a dot rather than a dash in between. When using the set variable in the UI builder, it will replace dots with dashes. So I've gone and replaced those in my USS file as well, because otherwise you do set variable and it doesn't quite work unless you go into the code. So this just makes it a little bit easier to use. Back to the UI builder. In here, we're going to look at the switch style next. There's only a couple of things that I want to do here. The main one being we want to set up the flex direction to be row. This just means that as you see stuff going down in the hierarchy, it's going to go left to right rather than top to bottom. And then the last thing I want to do here is set some margins. And this is just for later when we apply it into our main menu. So I want to set top to 10, bottom to 10, and left to 24. This just matches what we have for our other components. Again, I'd probably look at trying to set this up as variables at some point. So now to get into the main section is now we want to style the border and the control. So selecting the border, the first thing I'm going to do is scroll down. I'm going to define a size for a moment. At the moment, I think a width of 60 and a height of 40 is going to be about right. You can set this to whatever's appropriate for your particular project. And while I can hover over it and see it now, it'd be nice to actually see what I'm doing as I'm making changes. So the next step would be go down to background and we'll give it a color. So in here again, I'm going to set a variable for the background color. I'm going to scroll down and set it to highlight and full. This gives it a dark purple. Now I can see what I'm doing as I go. To give it the right shape, we're going to scroll down to the border section, and we're going to start with a radius, which I'm going to give as 20 pixels. This wants to be about half of what your height is. If you go less, you start getting flattened edges. If you go more, then it starts becoming more elliptical. So you want to make sure that it's exactly half of what your height is going to be. Next, I'm going to set a width of these borders, which I'm going to make 3 pixels. You're not going to see this for a moment until I set the color. Now, unfortunately, you can't set a variable on the top level color, so I've got to do it for each individual. So I'm going to set a variable, and each one of these is going to be highlight mid. As you can see, they start appearing. There we go. That's already a good start. Next, we want to make the little control that we want to ping backwards and forwards. So we'll go over into switch control. And in here, we'll again start with the size. Now, this you can play around with a little bit. I'm going to set this to 26 and 26. I obviously want it to be the same as I want a little round circle. And we're going to want something that's going to have a little bit of border. We don't want it completely flush with everything. And again, the next steps that I can see a bit more what I'm doing is set the color. I'm going to set the variable, and in this case I'm going to use highlight low. Why is that not showing up? As I'm sure everyone noticed when I was writing in the class, I named switch wrong when setting up the switch control. Name that correctly, and now we've got our control showing up. As you can see, it still looks a bit wrong, so next we're going to do the border and radius. This matters a little less, but just bring it up until it's a circle. In this case, I'm just going to define it as 20 just for a nice round number. You see we've got a nice round control at this point. The next stage is, obviously it's in completely the wrong place. There's a couple of things that we need to do to fix this. First one is to go back to switch border, and if we go up to the align section, there's 2 changes I want to make. I want to do justify content and set that to center. That's going to move the actual little control into the center point of the border itself. And then while I'm here, I'm also going to change align self. I'm going to change that to center so that it will appear in the center of the actual control as well. Again, depending on exactly how you're setting up this control, you might want to handle this in a slightly different fashion, but for now, I always want the switch to appear in the center of the control. So one last thing, and that is the switches butt up against this side. To fix that, we just go back into switch control, and I'm just going to go down to the margins and give it a margin of 4 pixels. As you can see, that now means that we've got that nice border around there. You can always calculate what that should be. So now everything looks like a switch. However, at this point, if I click preview, clicking on it doesn't do anything. And if I select the switch itself, nothing happens there. And text doesn't change here. At the moment, nothing is hooked up. We've just styled it to look the way that we want, which is fine. Now back in the code, we will handle the state of the switch, which will include controlling the text as well as the Boolean value. Text being the easier one to control, we're just going to quickly implement that first. If I go up to the text property, this is very simple. And instead of just having an auto property with a getter and a setter, we're going to use a lambda and then do the label.text. And the same in the set. Another lambda, label.text equals value. Now, if you have more complicated systems around how your text is displayed, then you might have these set up as functions that are called elsewhere. For example, if you've got a localization system that when the text gets passed in, it then localizes it before displaying it, you might want to set that up at this stage and potentially have a backing text class. For now, for this simple implementation, this is more than enough. What I am going to do at this point is I'm going to create a backing value for the value part here. So that's just going to be a private bool of value, which then means to get the value, I can just return the value section. Now that's going to throw an error because it wants me to set the value as well. Now that's going to be a little bit more complicated. So to handle that, I'm going to create myself a new function, which is going to be a void, and I'm just going to call it set, and it's going to take a boolean of value. So if we just jump back up to the top, another lambda, and we'll have set, which we will pass the value into. Now in set, the first thing we want to do is set up value so that the private field of the class is set correctly, so when you do the get, it will match. The next part I'm going to handle is the toggled action that we had before, which is going to do a conditional invoke of value, and this means anything that I've assigned from outside of this class to that toggled action, it's going to get the new value regardless of where I've set it from. And the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new function which I'm going to call setState. I'm going to pass in that value. This is what I'm going to use to change how the switch looks. This is a very simple function, and we'll set this as a private void setState, which takes in a bool of value. I should also note this set function should also be private. And in here, very simple, we're going to start with the border, and there's a function available which is called enable in class list. And what this does is you're able to pass a boolean and turn a class on or off on the component. So then that will apply a state later on. So inside of here, I'm going to have a new class, a new style class, which I'm going to call switch border underscore on, and then I can pass into this the value. So now if the value is true, then I'm going to have the class of on. If the value is false, then that class will be taken off. I'm going to do exactly the same thing for the control. Now there are ways that this can be done with a single class. However, in this particular context, I'm going to be applying it to everything individually. But you could handle this by just having an on class applied to the switch, and then handle that kind of going down the hierarchy. But this is just a little bit cleaner in terms of setting out the hierarchy of what you're trying to handle. So just to highlight what we've done, the text, if we edit that property, it's going to change the labels text to be the value that's passed in. And if we try and get the value, then we'll just get the text that's already there. For the value property, if we change it, it's going to call our set function, which is going to both change our backing class, invoke the action of toggled, and also set the classes on the toggle switch itself. And then if we do get, we'll just return the backing value. Now, if we jump back into the UI builder, if I now select the switch, you can see we've already got it taking in the value of text with this is some new text. I can change that to my heart's content, like so. But currently value isn't doing anything. Now this will actually be calling that toggle function in the background, but we haven't set up our extra classes. So let's start with that. So we need switch border underscore on and switch control underscore on. And now if we select our switch, make sure that the value is on, highlight over these classes, you can see that's selecting the appropriate part, but all of the classes are applied at the same time. If I turn the value off, you'll see that these two are no longer applying. So we'll switch value back on, and now we can style this to match what we want it to look like when the switch is in its on state. So for this, I'm going to change the border, so switch border on, and I'm going to look for a line, here we go, yes, in the align section, in the align items, rather than allowing that to kind of default it over to where it is, I'm going to set that to flex end. That's going to move the switch over to the right hand side. That's all I need for that style. And then for switch control on, I'm just going to scroll down to the background color, and I'm going to set the variable of that, and I'm going to set that to highlight mid, just so that it's really obvious. You get lots of feedback that that's in an on position. This is the simplest style of movement for a switch. You could have the control animate smoothly or make it draggable. If you would like to see videos on the other options, please leave a comment. Okay, so now if I select the switch again, you can see as I toggle the value, it's going to turn on and off like so. Now there's still one piece missing. If I click preview, you can see clicking on it still doesn't actually do anything. There's only one more change that we need to make for this, so if we just jump back into the code, all we need to do is add a callback. So in the constructor, just do a new line at the bottom. We're going to do register callback. In here we're going to have mouse down event, and inside of here we are going to create a function which we can just do EVT, which is the event callback values. We're not going to use any of these, but you just need the reference. Create our lambda, and in here we're just going to have value equals not value, and that's it. This will mean that any time that you do a mouse down event on any part of the switch UI, it's now going to toggle that component. Now, depending on how you want to set it up, you could also register this callback on the control itself, like so. And that means it'll only be when you click the control, or even you could have it on the border so that you could click anywhere in the border and it'll switch the switch. If we just jump back into the UI builder and I hit preview, we can now click anywhere on this. Can't click anywhere else, but on that, and it will switch backwards and forwards. And because we handled everything when you set value, this will be invoking the callback as well. So everything will be handled for you. And now, just to finish off this video, as I said, we were going to replace this full screen toggle. To do that, we can just delete this toggle that we had before, replace it instead with our new switch component in exactly the same place, and in there change this full screen, and the default value will be off. We can now save that, and if we just jump back into the code, and this is in the tutorial settings presenter class that we set up last video, rather than querying for the toggle, we'll now just query for our switch, which at the moment is called switch, but I will just change to be full screen toggle. As you can see, this is having a little bit of a erroring, so we just need to set up this so this is looking for a switch and not a toggle. Then down in the bottom here, set full screen. Now we're going to change this because this is no longer relevant. We don't need to do the register callback because we created our own callback action. So we'll do full screen toggle dot toggled, and we'll do a plus equals, and in there we have we'll have value, which we can then use to set full screen, and just pass that value in. And that's all that we need. Just delete the old line, and that's everything handled. And then down in the set resolution, when we set the resolution, we get the value of the toggle, set it. We don't have a lowercase v, we have an uppercase V for our particular implementation. And now everything will compile. And that's the end of this video. I hope you found it useful. Please like and subscribe to help me make more tutorials. And please do let me know in the comments if there's any other custom components that you'd like to see me build, or any other tutorials either in UI Toolkit or with Unity in general. Thanks for watching.